To discuss more about this, we're being joined on the news at 10 by the Executive Director of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, Mr. Clement Nwankwo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, how would you assess the National Assembly in 2017 in terms of its critical role of lawmaking, oversight and representation?
Lawmaking, I think that when you look at the National Assembly and from the report that has just been put out, there has been some good progress with some of the laws that have been passed. Of course, critical laws remain unpassed, and the report by your correspondent there talks about the petroleum industry bill, which has been the most outstanding bill that hasn't been passed by the National Assembly, and it's been in the Assembly for almost 12 years. The reforms that citizens expect with the Electoral Act and constitutional reform have been pending. Clearly, of course, the constitution reform bills have passed, and some of them are awaiting voting in the states. We're still waiting to see what happens with the Electoral Act, but these are bills that should have been passed. But I must point out that when you look at lawmaking, the question you need to ask is how many bills have the executive put into the National Assembly? When you look at the fact that several of the bills that the National Assembly have been dealing with have been member bills, you really ask yourself, who should set the legislative agenda for a government? Certainly, the executive has that responsibility to reform laws, to set a legislative agenda for the government, and this has not happened. This has been the major crisis with respect to passage of laws. Most of the laws have been individual member bills. They have had issues respecting even the quality of the bills, but certainly the executive has not taken any initiative in reforming the laws in the country or even using laws to bring about development or reform, and that has been the major problem. With respect to representation, I think there are several issues that come into play here. When you ask yourself the question whether members in the Senate or in the House are adequately representing their constituents, I think a lot of constituents would have questions whether this has been the case. And with respect to oversight, I think that there has been a major issue as well. When the National Assembly carries out, for instance, an investigative oversight, the expectation is that when they make findings, that the executive will take this very seriously. But clearly, it looks like even when an administration talks about fighting corruption, and the National Assembly does carry out investigative hearings that exposes corruption, the executive is reluctant to take any action. Indeed, it looks like the executive sees itself as being protective of the allegations of corruption from which the National Assembly makes recommendations. Expecting the executive to take action has been a very difficult one. And I think for a lot of Nigerians who are watching the National Assembly, there might be criticisms of the National Assembly, but certainly you do have an executive that has no legislative agenda, that has no legislative direction, and has not used the instrument of legislation to bring about development. And I think that this is really sad for Nigeria and sad for government in this country.
Mr. Nwankwo, you said it yourself, the 8th Assembly has conducted some high-profile investigations this year. So what's really the value of these investigations if the executive chooses not to implement it?
Well, it's an indictment on the executive. The legislature can only do what it can, which is to really investigate these issues. You'd expect that when the legislature makes findings, that the executive would be interested in the outcome of those findings. Some of these findings it should examine to see whether it requires even more law enforcement investigation and prosecution where allegations of corruption show up and the legislature makes findings. You'll expect that the executive will take action to plug the loopholes that the legislature has identified. We have not seen this, and this is not new. This was the case in the previous administration. This continues, and perhaps even worse with this administration. So I think really the big problem is an executive that is lethargic, that is unconcerned about government in the way that should produce the nature of development that this country needs. So while we do have some issues with the challenges that the legislature faces and some of its own failings even, I think the greater blame should go to the executive that has no idea what to do with a legislature that is really even willing to work with it to deal with some of the challenges of development that this country faces.
Mr. Clement Nwankwo, thank you so much for speaking with us. He's been speaking with us live from our studios in Abuja.